Officer Bradley Kane had built a reputation as a tough, no-nonsense cop. To the outside world, he was a decorated officer, respected for his ability to keep the streets in order. But behind that badge was something far darker, an unspoken prejudice that dictated how he treated people of color. In his mind, young black men and women were nothing more than trouble waiting to happen, criminals before they even had the chance to prove otherwise. The other officers in his precinct had seen it firsthand, the way Kane spoke about certain neighborhoods, the extra aggression he used during arrests, the smug satisfaction on his face when he booked another black teenager for a crime they may or may not have committed. But no one said a word. He was protected by the blue wall of silence. That night, Amara Johnson was driving home from her part-time job at a cafe. 16 years old, bright, ambitious, and with dreams of becoming a journalist, she had never been in trouble a day in her life. As she turned onto a quiet road leading to her neighborhood, flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Her heart pounded as she pulled over. She had done nothing wrong, but she had seen enough to know that sometimes that didn't matter. Kane approached the car, his flashlight glaring through her window. "License and registration," he barked. His tone alone sent a chill down her spine. Amara did as she was told, her hands shaking slightly. Kane snatched the documents from her, barely glancing at them before stepping back. "Step out of the vehicle." "Officer, did I do something wrong?" she asked, her voice steady but polite. Kane's lip curled. "I said, step out of the car." Swallowing her fear, Amara complied. Kane wasted no time patting her down, then yanking open her backpack. He rummaged through it roughly before his fingers curled around something. With a triumphant smirk, he pulled out a wallet, one that wasn't hers. Well, he said, holding it up. "Looks like you've been busy." Amara's eyes widened. "That's not mine. I don't even know where that came from." Kane chuckled, his grip tightening on her arm. "Save it for the judge." He dragged her to his cruiser and shoved her inside. Amara could barely process what was happening. It didn't matter that she was innocent. He had already decided her guilt. At the station, she sat in a holding cell while her mother, Naomi Johnson, pleaded for someone to listen. Kane leaned against the desk, arms crossed, watching with an amused expression. "Your kind always ends up here," he muttered, just loud enough for Naomi to hear. Rage flashed across the woman's face. "My daughter is innocent," Kane shrugged. "Tell it to the judge." Days later, Amara found herself standing in a cold courtroom, her wrists still sore from the handcuffs that had been too tight. She had barely spoken since that night, the fear and humiliation pressing down on her like a weight. Kane was there, standing tall and confident, ready to see his version of justice served. Then the prosecutor spoke. "Your Honor, before proceeding, there's something you should know." The room stilled as he turned to the back of the courtroom. The doors opened, and a man in a sharp black suit stepped forward. The murmurs began almost instantly. Kane frowned, shifting uncomfortably. Something about the man's presence sent a prickle of unease down his spine. "This is Marcus Johnson," the prosecutor continued, "a U.S. attorney for the Department of Justice and Amara Johnson's father." A thick silence fell over the room. Kane's confidence wavered. He had been so sure that Amara was just another nameless black teenager with no one to fight for her. But now, the reality of the situation hit him like a freight train. Marcus Johnson approached the judge, his expression unreadable. "Your Honor, I have obtained new evidence that directly contradicts Officer Kane's account." A screen flickered to life, showing security footage from a street camera near the scene of the arrest. The entire courtroom watched in stunned silence as Kane was caught on camera slipping the wallet into Amara's bag. Gasps filled the room, Kane's face drained of color. The judge's gaze turned icy. "Officer Kane, do you have an explanation for this?" For the first time in his career, Kane was speechless. Marcus Johnson turned to face him, his voice calm but laced with an unmistakable edge. "You thought she was powerless. You thought you could manipulate the system, as you always have. But not this time." The ruling was swift. Amara's charges were dropped and Kane was placed under arrest. His fellow officers, the same ones who had once turned a blind eye, now refused to meet his gaze. As he was led away in handcuffs, the irony wasn't lost on him. All these years, he had treated black citizens like criminals without proof, and now here he was, exposed, humiliated, and powerless in the very system he had used to destroy others. Sitting in a cold, gray cell, Kane finally had time to reflect. For years, he had wielded his badge like a weapon, believing himself untouchable. But justice had a way of catching up. The system he had manipulated had finally turned against him. Meanwhile, Amara walked out of the courtroom, her head held high, her dignity restored. She turned once to glance at Kane, her voice soft but firm. "You should have known, truth always wins." Officer Bradley Kane had mastered the art of making things look real. He knew how to twist a story, how to make people believe his version of events, and most importantly, how to manipulate the system so that no one ever questioned him. To him, framing someone was easy. It was just another part of the job, a way to keep the people he considered trouble exactly where he thought they belonged. And tonight, Amara Johnson was his next target. After pulling her over, Kane wasted no time establishing control. The flashing red and blue lights bathed the dark street in an eerie glow, making the already tense moment feel even more suffocating. Amara had never been in a situation like this before, but she had heard enough horror stories from her parents to know how quickly things could escalate. She kept her hands visible, spoke with respect, and complied with every order, hoping that would be enough. But Kane had already decided how this night would go. As she stood outside her car, watching the officer rifle through her belongings without reason, she swallowed the lump forming in her throat. "Officer, please, I don't understand. What did I do wrong?" Kane didn't answer. Instead, he pulled open her backpack, his gloved hands rummaging through it with little care for its contents. Books, a notebook, a half-eaten granola bar, nothing suspicious, nothing illegal. But that didn't matter, because Kane had come prepared. With a calculated sleight of hand, he reached into his own pocket, his fingers curling around the slim leather wallet he had been holding onto since the start of his shift. He had confiscated it from a different case, but now it would serve a new purpose. In one smooth motion, he slipped the wallet into Amara's bag and pulled it back out as if he had just discovered it buried beneath her belongings. He held it up in the glow of the streetlights, turning it over dramatically in his hands. "Well, well," he said, a smirk creeping across his face. "Looks like someone's been busy." Amara's eyes widened in pure disbelief. "That's not mine." Kane let out a chuckle, shaking his head. "Right, because wallets just magically appear in people's bags." Terror crashed over her like a tidal wave. She took a step back, shaking her head in desperation. "I swear, I don't know where that came from. Please, you have to believe me." Kane didn't hesitate. He grabbed her wrist and yanked it forward, his grip tight and unyielding. "Save it for the judge," he said coldly, snapping handcuffs around her wrists before she could even process what was happening. Tears welled in Amara's eyes. "Please, you're making a mistake." But to Kane, this was no mistake. This was exactly how he had planned it. As he led her toward his patrol car, he ignored the way her body trembled, ignored the raw fear in her voice. He had seen this reaction before. Pleading, begging, tears. It never mattered. He was always in control, and no one would ever question his word over hers. When they arrived at the police station, Amara was shoved into a chair as officers processed her like a criminal. Fingerprints, mugshots, paperwork. She barely had time to think, her mind racing in circles, trying to figure out how things had gone so horribly wrong. Her mother, Naomi Johnson, stormed into the station not long after, her face tight with fury and desperation. "Where is my daughter?" she demanded. The officer at the desk barely looked up. "You'll have to wait until she's processed." Naomi clenched her fists, trying to keep her composure. "Processed for what?" "My daughter hasn't done anything wrong." That was when Kane stepped into the conversation. Arms crossed, expression smug, he glanced at Naomi with the same dismissive look he had given countless black mothers before her. "Your daughter was caught with a stolen wallet," he said matter-of-factly. "She's lucky it wasn't something worse." Naomi's eyes darkened. "You're lying." Kane smirked. "I have evidence, ma'am. Your daughter was in possession of stolen property. End of story." Naomi took a step closer, her voice deadly calm. "Officer, do you even know who I am?" Kane let out a low chuckle. "Lady, I don't care who you are. I don't care what sob story you have. Your kid got caught breaking the law, and now she's going to face the consequences." Amara could hear the conversation from inside the holding area. Her mother's voice gave her a glimmer of hope, but the weight of the handcuffs around her wrists reminded her that she was still trapped. Kane turned back toward the desk, fully expecting the night to end in his favor. Another arrest, another case closed. But what he didn't realize was that this time, he had picked the wrong person to frame. Because Naomi Johnson wasn't just another helpless mother pleading for justice in a system designed to ignore her. She was the wife of Marcus Johnson, a high-ranking U.S. attorney for the Department of Justice. And Kane had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The courtroom was packed. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone inside. Amara sat in her chair, her wrists free now, but still carrying the invisible weight of the injustice she had endured. Her mother, Naomi, sat beside her, jaw clenched, hands clasped tightly together. She had spent the last few nights restless, consumed by anger and fear. But now, here they were, in front of a judge, waiting for the fate of her daughter to be decided. Officer Bradley Kane sat confidently at the other side of the courtroom, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. He had done this 100 times before. He had seen black teenagers walk into courtrooms looking scared, knowing the odds were against them. And every time, the system worked in his favor. He was the officer. His word was the truth. The defendant was just another name on a list, another case he'd close without a second thought. The prosecutor stood, shuffling a few papers before clearing his throat. "Your Honor," he began, "before we proceed, there is an important matter that needs to be addressed." A murmur swept through the room as the doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. The footsteps were measured, deliberate, and as the figure moved forward, Kane's smirk faltered for the first time. A tall man in a dark suit approached the prosecutor's table. His presence was commanding, and even those who didn't recognize him could feel the power he carried. He placed a briefcase on the table before looking up, his sharp eyes locking onto Kane. "Your Honor," the prosecutor continued, "this is Marcus Johnson, U.S. Attorney for the Department of Justice, and the father of the defendant, Amara Johnson." The room went completely silent. Kane's stomach twisted. The name alone sent a jolt of realization through him. Marcus Johnson wasn't just any attorney. He was one of the most respected federal prosecutors in the country. He was a man who had built his career on exposing corruption, dismantling criminal networks, and more importantly, holding law enforcement accountable. Kane's heartbeat quickened. This wasn't supposed to happen. Amara wasn't supposed to have anyone who could fight for her. She was supposed to be just another black teenager caught in a system designed to bury people like her. He had thought this would be an easy case, another routine arrest where his version of events would go unquestioned. But now, everything had changed. Marcus Johnson took a step forward, his face unreadable. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, his voice steady but sharp, "the prosecution has new evidence that directly contradicts Officer Kane's allegations against my daughter." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Proceed." A screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. The footage that appeared was grainy at first, but then it sharpened, showing a quiet street bathed in the glow of streetlights. Amara's car was parked on the side of the road. Then Officer Kane came into frame, approaching the vehicle. The camera angle wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough to show what happened next. Kane reached into his pocket. His hand emerged with something small, something that hadn't been in Amara's possession before. He leaned into the car, then into her backpack. Seconds later, he pulled his hand out, now holding the wallet. The evidence was undeniable. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Naomi's hands clenched into fists, her eyes burning with fury. Amara's breath caught in her throat, a mixture of relief and disbelief washing over her. Kane, for the first time in his life, felt the sensation of real fear settle in his chest. The judge turned to him, expression cold. "Officer Kane, do you have an explanation for this?" Kane opened his mouth, but no words came out. Marcus Johnson stepped closer, his gaze never leaving the disgraced officer. "You thought she was powerless," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You thought you could manipulate the system, that no one would believe a young black girl over a police officer. But you made a mistake." Kane swallowed hard, his throat dry. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room staring at him, judging him. His fellow officers who had once stood by him now refused to meet his gaze. The judge's voice rang through the courtroom. Officer Kane, in light of this damning evidence, I am ordering your immediate arrest for falsifying a police report, tampering with evidence, and violating the rights of a citizen under the law. The sound of handcuffs clicking open filled the room. The irony wasn't lost on Kane. For years, he had been the one tightening cuffs around the wrists of black teenagers, treating them like criminals before they even had a chance to prove their innocence. Now, he felt the cold steel bite into his own wrists. As he was led toward the back of the courtroom, his mind raced. How had everything gone so wrong? He had always believed he was untouchable, that no one would ever question his authority. But standing there, in the very system he had once used to destroy others, he finally understood. He had never been above the law. He had simply been getting away with it. Until now. Amara watched as he was escorted away, her heart still pounding. She had spent days fearing that no one would believe her, that the truth would be buried under lies. But in the end, the truth had won. As Marcus Johnson turned to his daughter, his expression softened. "Are you okay?" Amara nodded slowly. It wasn't just relief she felt. It was something deeper, a renewed sense of power. She had been wrongfully accused, humiliated, treated as less than human, but now she had her justice, and Officer Bradley Kane had learned the hardest lesson of his life. Sitting in a cold gray holding cell, Officer Bradley Kane could still feel the phantom weight of the handcuffs around his wrists. He had placed those cuffs on countless people over the years, but never, not once, had he imagined he would be on the receiving end. The steel had felt foreign against his skin, an unfamiliar reality pressing into his bones. He had been so certain, so confident that no one would question his actions. After all, he was a police officer. His word had always been enough to convict. He had framed kids like Amara Johnson before, planted evidence, exaggerated reports, twisted the truth until it fit his narrative, and it had worked every time, until now. The weight of his current situation was suffocating. He could hear the buzz of officers outside the holding area, hushed whispers as they spoke about what had happened. Some were shocked, others, not so much. Kane had built a reputation in the precinct, not just for being a tough cop, but for the way he handled cases involving black suspects. There had been rumors, quiet concerns, but no one had dared to challenge him before. He had always been protected, but not anymore. The courtroom scene played over and over in his mind like a broken reel. The way the footage had exposed him in front of everyone, the gasps that had filled the room, the silence that followed when the judge ordered his arrest, the humiliation that burned through him as he was forced to stand there, powerless, as the very system he had manipulated turned against him. And then there was Marcus Johnson. Kane had known the name, of course. Everyone in law enforcement knew about Marcus Johnson, the relentless U.S. attorney who had built a career on dismantling corruption and exposing officers who thought they were above the law. He had never expected the man to be Amara Johnson's father. He had assumed, like he always did, that the girl came from a powerless family, that she wouldn't have anyone with enough influence to fight back. But he had been wrong. For the first time in his life, Kane felt what it was like to be truly afraid. Not the kind of fear that came from a dangerous suspect or a risky situation on the job, but the kind of fear that settled deep in the soul, the realization that his actions had finally caught up with him. He had spent years treating black citizens with disdain, believing he'd get away with anything. And, in many ways, he had. He had stopped young men on the street for no reason, searched cars without probable cause, escalated situations until he could justify an arrest. He had spoken down to black mothers like Naomi Johnson, dismissed their pleas, ignored their pain. To him, they had never been more than statistics, faces in a mugshot, names on a report. But now he was the one being processed. His fingerprints were taken, his mugshot was snapped. The same routine he had forced upon others, now being forced upon him. The hours passed slowly in the holding cell. The walls felt like they were closing in. He had never known what it was like to be trapped like this, to have his fate rest in the hands of others. He had always been the one in control, but now he was just another prisoner waiting for judgment. At some point, he heard approaching footsteps. He looked up as the cell door opened, and in stepped Marcus Johnson. The U.S. Attorney's gaze was calm, but there was something sharp behind it. A quiet, restrained fury. He stepped forward, standing just outside the bars, looking down at Kane like he was studying an insect under a magnifying glass. Kane swallowed hard, forcing himself to hold the man's gaze. "You thought you could get away with it?" Marcus finally said, his voice steady. "Didn't you?" Kane didn't respond. What could he say? "I've seen men like you before," Marcus continued. "Men who wear the badge like it makes them untouchable. Men who think they have the right to decide who matters and who doesn't, who gets justice and who doesn't. But here you are." Kane exhaled slowly, trying to keep his composure. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, though even he didn't believe the words. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Was planting evidence part of your job? Falsifying reports? Tearing apart families?" Kane clenched his jaw. He had nothing to say. Nothing he could say. Marcus took a step closer. "You should be grateful, Officer Kane. You're getting something most of your victims never got, the chance to defend yourself in court. A fair trial. Due process." His voice darkened. "How many people did you deny that same right?" Kane looked away, unable to hold his gaze anymore. Marcus let the silence stretch between them before speaking again. "You will face consequences for what you did to my daughter, for what you've done to countless others before her. The days of you hiding behind your badge are over." With that, Marcus turned and walked out, leaving Kane alone with his thoughts. For the first time, the reality of what he had done truly settled in. He had ruined lives, he had sent innocent people to jail, treated them as less than human. And now, he was the one facing judgment. The weight of it all crushed him, because in the end, the truth had caught up with him, and there was no escaping it. The courtroom was quieter now. The echoes of the verdict still lingered in the air, wrapping around Officer Bradley Kane like a noose tightening around his neck. Guilty. The word had been spoken with finality, sealing his fate. He sat in his chair, staring at the floor, feeling the weight of everything crash down on him. The once confident officer, the man who had built his career on intimidation and manipulation, now looked small, broken. Across the room, Amara Johnson sat beside her mother, her fingers intertwined tightly in her lap. She wasn't smiling. There was no joy in this, no celebration. Justice had been served, but the scars Kane had left would not heal overnight. The fear, the humiliation, the knowledge that her life could have been destroyed if not for that security footage, it would all stay with her. She had spent nights awake, thinking about the what-ifs. What if her father hadn't been who he was? What if no one had believed her? What if the footage had never existed? The terrifying truth was that if circumstances had been just a little different, she could have been locked away, branded a criminal for a crime she never committed, and Kane would have walked away, untouched, moving on to his next target. But not this time. Kane had spent years bending the system to his will, treating black people as if they were disposable, as if their lives were less valuable. He had framed young men, humiliated black mothers, treated families like their voices didn't matter. And now he was finally being forced to listen. The judge had made it clear this was not a simple case of police misconduct. This was a deliberate, calculated act of racial profiling and abuse of power. Kane had used his badge not to serve and protect, but to control and destroy. And the law had caught up with him. The judge's voice rang in his ears as he replayed the sentencing in his mind. "Officer Kane, your actions have not only harmed an innocent young girl, but they have also eroded the trust between law enforcement and the community you swore to protect. You abused your power, you falsified evidence, you manipulated the justice system for your own gain, and now you will be held accountable." The sentence was severe. Prison time, the loss of his badge, a permanent stain on his record. He would never work in law enforcement again. He would never hold power over another person's life. The reputation he had once worn like armor was now nothing but a disgraceful reminder of what he had become. As the courtroom began to empty, Marcus Johnson stood from his seat. He had said little throughout the proceedings, letting the evidence speak for itself. But now, as Kane sat frozen in place, staring at nothing, Marcus walked toward him. Kane tensed, bracing for words of anger, maybe even gloating. But when Marcus spoke, his voice was calm. "Do you understand now?" Kane slowly lifted his gaze, confusion flickering in his eyes. Marcus continued, his expression unreadable. Do you finally see what it's like to have the system turn against you, to be accused, to have no one believe you, to feel powerless? Kane swallowed hard. The truth was suffocating. You thought you were invincible, Marcus went on. You thought your badge would protect you forever, that no one would ever question you. But power doesn't last forever, and justice always catches up. Kane wanted to say something, anything, but no words came. What could he say? That he was sorry? That he didn't mean for things to go this far? That he was just doing what he had always done? No excuse would change the truth. Marcus let out a slow breath, shaking his head. My daughter will move on from this. She will heal. But you're going to have to live with what you've done. And maybe, just maybe, you'll finally understand the weight of the lives you've ruined. With that, he turned and walked away. Naomi and Amara followed, never sparing Kane another glance. They had their justice. They had their truth. And now they were leaving him behind, just like the system he had once relied on had left him. As Kane was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the reality of his downfall settled in. The whispers, the stares, the disgust in the eyes of the people who had once worked alongside him, it was all proof of how far he had fallen. He had thought he was untouchable, but in the end, justice had proven otherwise.